So welcome to today's session. We are going to be covering innovation and succession. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Kevin Kan, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Professional Coaches Board. I serve as a Global Director in the Professional Coaches Board. So welcome once again. We will be covering the topic of succession, and we'll be having a conversation around this. So why is succession important? Succession planning, who will come after me? Some of the objectives we'll be covering today include defining and outlining succession planning process. We're also going to discuss best practices and key success factors in succession planning. The third objective of this session is sharing practical tips to effectively plan for succession of volunteer leaders. So let's look at the overview of today's session in terms of the topic specifics that we are going to cover. The first one is succession and why it matters. The second one is success factors to consider in the succession planning process. We'll also look at the 4 pillars of succession planning. Is it as good as it looks on paper? Some thought-provoking questions there. We're going to discuss that as well. And then best practices in succession planning. So let's get on with it. The first being, why does it matter? So let me begin by just giving an overview of what succession really is. And I want to share this quote by Paul Cantor, who's the former chairman of Russell Reynolds Association in Canada. He says that succession planning cannot take place in a vacuum. It should be an intensive, comprehensive initiative, much more than a preparation of a list of names that will be tabled if the CEO is hit by a bus. Similarly, succession plans will not increase the productivity growth rate of the firm if they are designed only to allow the internal auditor to tick the box succession in place. So again, right here, I think speaks to why we do succession. And a lot of times organizations have probably found themselves doing this, maybe to tick a box. Hopefully this is not what ICF will be doing, but I think it's really around an intentional process of looking at who are the individuals that will come after us and how can we plan for that more pragmatically, more proactively, depending on who we have on board. So I picked this definition. Succession planning is a process of selecting and developing key talent to ensure continuity of critical roles. Simple as it sounds, it is not as easy. It is quite a complex process in terms of really finding these people and maintaining that sustainability within the organization. We will be discussing some of these in the next couple of slides. But before that, I just want to also share that the overarching goal of succession management is to have a pool or a pipeline of prepared leaders, not just a list of prospective candidates across all organization levels to fill vacancies in positions when needed. And this is important. And I think I've highlighted prepared leaders because there is work that goes around this whole process. There is work around identifying them, and then you go into developing these leaders, having a plan for them. If we want them to be ready in 2 to 3 years' time, what kind of leaders do you want to see? What kind of competencies do you want to have? So that's really, really important. So it's not just a replacement approach where you have a list of people and just keep it there. It goes beyond that. Right. So coming closer home, ICF, do we have succession plans in place? Do we have succession plans for our staff, for example, at the executive level, all the way from the CEO to the vice presidents, different directors? And do we have succession plans for the global leadership? And then again, looking at the chapters, how do we prepare for succession? Do we have those in place? I wonder how many of you listening to this presentation today can put up their hand and say, we have all this in place. If you're a chapter leader, within your country, you can say, we already have the 5 to 7 people who will come after us. If you do, Well done. And let's see some of the practices probably that you are embodying and practicing at your different countries and within the chapter level. I think the one thing I just want to highlight on here is that it's not too bad if you don't have it, because there's always a beginning. And I think the purpose of this sharing is really to be able to see what can you pick from this presentation, what insights can you pick to enable you to go and prepare adequately for future leaders within your different chapters, whether it's within the ICF staffing organization or at a global leadership level. So in this next slide, Kevin and I will be discussing, why it's important. What are some of the benefits of succession planning? And I want to hand it over to Kevin to take us through some of those pointers.
So preparedness is going to be something that's important for business continuity. But specifically in the chapter, how do you keep your chapter going if there are going to be changes in your leadership structure? Whether it's somebody that's leaving because it's the end of their term, or whether somebody has to leave because their job requires them to spend more time at work so they can't devote time to the chapter anymore. So how is your chapter going to continue the operations to engage with your members at each of your chapter levels? Then if we have a look at growth, it's really important to make sure that the succession plan helps you give volunteers the opportunity to grow. How are they going to develop new skills? And how are they going to get the ability to build their experience so that they can motivate and develop the next set of volunteers that come in? Because why do people volunteer? They want to volunteer so that not only to give back to the chapter and the members, but also to gain experience as well. So people want the opportunity to learn and grow. Diversity is super important because we need to make sure that we have chapter leaders that are a cross representation of all the members in your chapter. So how diverse is the leadership team when you enable more views and perceptions so that you can consider them when developing engagement activities and events for members? That's why you need to have a diverse leadership team in your chapter. Having a succession plan also enables the chapter leadership team to develop credibility with their members so that they know what you're doing, so that they know that you have a planned succession in place and that the chapter will continue with the strategic initiatives for the following years to come. And lastly, now more than ever, we need to make sure that we have innovation. Times are changing. We have to adapt to changing rules and regulations. We need to make sure that our succession planning is innovative and it brings in people who can innovate and adapt to changing circumstances. Emily.
Thanks, Kevin. So the next piece I want to discuss is that, when you have succession plans in place, you actually embrace creativity in the sense that the new people that are coming on board have got new ideas, and therefore, it just brings fresh blood and fresh thinking into the organization. The other piece is really around engagement, because you recognize when people are in one place or position for such a long time, and there's that familiarity, there is need, for example, to do things differently. There is need to increase the level of activities. And again, the engagement comes not just in doing, but also in being, and in terms of just interacting with the diverse groups of people that are coming in and out of the organization every other year. I think one piece that's really close to my heart and it's important is that we also need to avoid what you call the founder syndrome. If you're a chapter leader or you've been leading the organization, for years, for instance, you don't want to be the one and only. I think it just doesn't send the right messages. around our thinking in terms of diversity, our thinking in terms of, how do we sustain the organization going forward? And also it just kind of discourages things that we've discussed, such as creativity. So it's really, really important to bring in new people on board. And it shows that for you as a leader, whether you're the chapter leader or holding any other positions, that you are open to inclusivity, that you're open to new people and new ideas coming into the organization. What's really important, is the two elements of continuity and stability as well. When I say continuity, it's that if a chapter leadership team is on this year, you don't want after 2 years, when everyone is exiting, is when you're wondering, okay, who takes on these positions? And what's unique about volunteer organizations such as ours is that not everybody has time, and some people have really to be convinced, what's in need for them. And I think that's the one thing that we really need to articulate to those who are coming to serve, so that they also appreciate the need to continue to do so. And also, how do we support them so that that continuity is attained? And most importantly, keeping the history of the organization, making it stable, so that tomorrow, if one leader goes, we're not having a problem of replacement. We're not having to do last minute changes. It's really, really important for us to prepare for it. It's important for us to communicate. It's important for us to have plans that support, the leadership, not just for today, but for tomorrow and the days to come. So what are some of the success factors to consider in when you talk about succession planning?
So what are the prerequisites for success? To enable a successful succession plan, all leaders on the chapter leadership team have to endorse and agree to the succession plan process and the execution of the plan itself. As leaders, you will inspire members to volunteer their time to join the leadership team, just like you. It's important to ensure that you also map the critical roles that you need to fill as a part of your chapter leadership team and your recruitment process. So you need to ensure that you have a pipeline of potential candidates for critical roles in your chapter, like the director of membership, or the director of communications, or even the director of events. And lastly, you need to ensure that you have good job descriptions for each role in your chapter leadership, so that you can easily recruit and fill an empty position, or to start advertising for elections as a part of your pipeline gathering or election gathering process. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Now let's look at the 4 pillars of succession planning. The first being, start right, always. And what does that mean? Having a strong leadership in place is important. And I think by the time you're elected or you come in as a board, already it's important to just assess what your key strengths are as a leadership. It's important also to strive for diversity when you're looking at, the people who will lead your chapter. Whether it's diversity in terms of the experience or age profiles or skill set or interest, I think that's really, really important to consider. And then clarity of purpose. Who do we serve and why do we serve them? And so really, really important for volunteer leaders to be able to know the why, and so that even as they give in their time, they are really, really, aligned in terms of aligned vision as a leadership group. And then looking at developing the leadership competencies, profiling, what is our skill set as a leadership team? What are our key competencies, whether it's in strategy, some are good at strategy, others digital skills or marketing skills, public relations, finance skills. So all these are important to kind of have a list around those, so that then you can actually have a look at that picture and say, are we well represented? does this create a balance, so that then as you go into the second pillar, you're actually asking yourselves questions like, do we have the right bench strength? Are we strong enough in the sense that tomorrow, if something happened, we know that we have covered all the different areas of the chapter, and our leaders are able to handle the specific responsibilities with ease because they are actually aligned with their areas of strength. The second piece to do around this pillar is to identify critical roles, which Kevin did mention earlier on, whether it's the treasurer or the marketing person or the chair or the vice chair. The ICF terminology, we have the president and the president-elect. And I find that within the ICF ecosystem, we have done really well in terms of succession of those two roles, because year on year, that the president-elect will be the president for the next year. But we haven't done the same for all the other roles. So that's a challenge, and that's something that needs to be looked at. And then identifying high potential leaders. If you're within the organizational context, say the ICF staff leadership, the different roles from the CEO to the vice chairs to the vice presidents, directors, and the like, saying who are some of the high potentials within the organization below us that tomorrow, if we left, could take up these roles. So, and there are different ways in which you can identify these particular leaders, whether it's in terms of performance or their aspirations or just their interest and knowledge within ICF. There are different parameters that you can use to identify who those high potential leaders would be. Now, when you look at it from the context of chapters, because of the volunteer aspect of it, you also now need to look at, well, are we going to start, kind of attracting these leaders from either through committees or whenever you have events, you'll be able to recognize the people who could represent you well. You will identify them through, even the informal activities that you have, the education events, any kind of, programs that you're running within the chapter, because it's through those small committees that sometimes we're able to pick out 1 or 2, 3 people who we see standing out, who we see that have interest. And even some of them may not even have the confidence that they can lead, reaching out to them and saying, we think you can do this. Would you be willing to come in and serve even, part-time basis? So as they start at the lower levels, then you know that you're intentionally positioning them, you are exposing them, and you're also watching them just to see how they advance, so that when the time comes, they can then apply for those particular roles. And of course, consider having a diverse pool. We cannot emphasize diversity. That's really, really key. And we did speak about that earlier. Now, the third pillar is developing and grooming these leaders. Now, how do you do that? How do you develop these leaders for tomorrow, the ones we have identified as our high potentials? One of the ways is that, once you have selected them, is to even assign them a mentor for each role. For example, whether it's at the global level, then when new leaders come in, we have Kevin here, who's a strategic initiatives director. So then we say, well, Kevin will be mentoring somebody else who we think is new to the board and who is potentially going to be taking on this role. Same case as, finance, for example, the treasurer of the organization, then looking at it and saying who has a background in finance. And even if they don't, just trying to create the interest and explaining what the role is all about and what are the do's of this particular role, what are some of the challenges. So it may well be that you don't even have the skills within the board, but just by virtue of having a mentor who explains the days to days, the ins and outs of the particular position, then the new individual is able to create interest, to develop interest around the same. The third piece that's also important is really investing in training of these potential leaders and even existing ones. What kind of training would that be? It could be training around board governance. It could be training around strategic leadership and anything that will really mold them into positioning themselves, and things around executive presence, around speaking in public, presentations, So there's a diverse list of areas where you can train, but also it all depends on the need. It depends on what are the strengths of this individual and where can they improve. So that's how you identify that particular training for them. The ICF, for example, has got every year they have a volunteer leaders training that is organized through the Global Leadership Forum. We also have leaders who've been sent out, for board governance kind of training, especially in the perspective of looking at nonprofits, because how you govern nonprofits is very different from the for-profit organizations. So therefore, having that exposure through training, meeting different people in different countries, and now in a virtual world, we are able even to do much more. And then, of course, there's a 360 assessment, which speaks to more personal growth and also identifying your key strengths as a leader. How are you perceived by your teams, and where can you improve? So having a whole 360-degree view. So 360 assessments are quite popular when it comes to leadership development, coupled with executive coaching, which you can extend to your staff, as well as, your leaders, or obviously budget allowing. And that brings me to the point that development comes with investment. So there's not just time involved, but there's also money involved. Therefore, very important to have a budget in place that is going to take care of this very, very important piece. And finally, enhancing visibility and networks for these individuals so that people get to know this is the ICF Kenya chapter or Singapore chapter president, and these are the leaders, and this is what they're doing. So that exposure is really, really important, and encouraging them to be seen and to be heard as they communicate the value of ICF membership, as they communicate the strategies that ICF is running. And the final pillar that I'll be discussing is, documenting it. Remember, the leaders will be here today, and 2 years, 3 years later, you don't want to start having new people having to find, okay, where are the registration documents for this chapter? Had we paid our dues? Had we done XYZ? So really, really important to have documents in place. One, they preserve the history of the chapter. They make it easier for incoming leaders so that they don't have to start from scratch. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. It also makes it easier to share information. It just makes their learning curve much faster. And of course, keeping a diverse pool of talent so that if a new leadership comes in place, they may not know these people, but if there's a pool that's already existing, they can easily reach out to these people and pick up conversations with them as far as leadership is concerned. Now, where are you on this continuum, if I might ask you who's listening to us today? Are you more on the left, where you're just replacing leaders, you identify and you replace? Are you in the middle, which is the succession planning itself? You identify your successors and you develop your successors. Yeah. Now, if you're doing that and more, which is on the right end of the spectrum, it includes all organizational levels. You're identifying your successors, you're developing them, and you're also doing this not just for the top 3 officer levels, not just for the top level of CEO, vice presidents, directors. No, you're going all the way to the organization. Now, majority of organizations obviously begin with the very top layer or even the second. And remember, I said this costs money, it costs time, and therefore, if you're really going to do it right, it's important to have the planning right and also put investment in there. So that then it's not just one individual who's taking care of this. If it's in the organizational context, the HR leader of that organization should be the owner of this, together with the CEO, to make sure that these are reviewed year on year. And these conversations are happening at a very senior level, at an executive level.
Okay, so we've now got some processes in place, but is it as good as it looks on paper? Let's have a look at this. So what is the composition of your chapter leadership? What's the structure? What's the tenure? And what are you bound by in terms of your chapter charter? So let's make sure that you have the right tenure for people to be voted to become the next president-elect or the next president. Do you meet all the criteria that is in the charter of your chapter? And how long have people been on as a volunteer? Is it time to renew? As Emily mentioned before, it's important to make sure that you have new points of view so that new ways of thinking, new ways of connecting with your members at a chapter level are always brought onto your volunteer leadership team. The second thing to have a look at in terms of reality is what's the gender composition, what's the age composition, and also your volunteers, what type of coaching do they do? There are so many different types of coaches out there today, all the way from executive to leadership to career to wellness to even of health and even a financial coach. So do you have a good cross-representation of the different coaches that are on your volunteer leadership so that you can try and engage the rest of the community or the rest of the membership to attract them to come to events, to attend your professional development, or maybe even your communities of practice? The third area that we'll have a look at is what happens if a candidate withdraws? So what's the backup in your candidate pipeline? That's why it's important to have a succession plan. Because sometimes when people go through the interview process to get shortlisted to put onto the ballot so that they can be elected, some things may change, whether it is personal, family, or from a work perspective. They may not be able to devote much time to the chapter volunteer process. And that way, they may have to withdraw. So what's your backup plan? Do you have sufficient replacements or potential candidates that can be put up for elections? And what happens if elected members don't turn up for meetings? So they've been elected and they've missed 3 or 4 consecutive meetings, either because of work commitments, they're overseas, they're on vacation. That leaves a hole in terms of your chapter volunteers, in terms of somebody else has to pick up the slack. So have you, from a succession plan, engaged the commitment of the volunteers who want to join your chapter leadership team? Then lastly, some realities to have a look at is really your chapter charter rules. Who are eligible to be voted on? Who are eligible to be on the ballot? When do elections have to be held? Who can participate? Who can vote? How quickly does the vote has to be done before the end of the chapter year? All of these considerations need to be taken into place. And hopefully, as chapter leadership, you all have a good understanding of what your charter requires you to do. Emily.
Let's look at the 5 the best practices of succession planning. The first one being that we need to start early. How early is early? As soon as we are on board, as soon as we have taken on our seats on the board, it's important to ask ourselves the questions that we just addressed, looking at the different pillars of succession planning and looking at, do we have the bench strength? And then number 2 would be having a long-term perspective, which means that the organization is bigger than ourselves. The chapter is bigger than us as individuals. So looking at the chapter 3 years to come, 5 years to come, how do we want to see it? How do we want to see it evolve? And what kind of skills and competencies would we need in order to take the chapter there? So really combining the strategic outlook of the particular organization or chapter in this case, and matching that with individuals who would be able to take it to those levels. Even though, the tenures are pretty short when it comes to the current ICF volunteer leadership, but it is still important. It is possible to keep a long-term view, even though the leaders are coming for shorter periods. So having a mentor for each role is so critical, like I mentioned. So consider having older chapter leaders, whether it's past presidents or past treasurers or past marketing and events leaders, consider inviting them, to be mentors to those who are coming in. And I think that's one of the ways also of just keeping them engaged, even though they've already left and their terms are over. It's important that, to keep them involved so that they can handhold these ones who are coming onto the chapter leadership. Either you could take that approach, or you could use the current existing leadership to mentor individuals who you foresee taking on in future. And then be realistic, very important. Now, you don't want to talk about replacing a director or a CEO of a company when you know they're going to be there for what, 5 years, 10 years, and then you have a 5-year kind of plan, succession plan, when you know individuals will stay longer than that, or you have a 3-year and you know this particular person is only going to be here for 1 year. So very, very important. Look at the structure of the organization. How is it structured? How are the contracts of these job holders? How long are they? So that then, even if you are going to be attracting talent from out there, you are attracting talent, and they clearly know that this role is going to be open in X period of time. And so that then you also don't set unnecessary expectations, which would be the number 7 on this slide, managing expectations and communicating to those who you've identified as your high potential leaders, for example, to take on leadership in the future. And also looking at even the chapter leadership, for example, if you have been talking to committee members and saying, we want you to be, to take on the president-elect next year, we want you to take on the treasurer role next year, what is it that makes you so certain about that? So that we are also not promising, we are not creating expectations that we cannot manage. So very, very important to have that alignment. And then very important as well is measure your outcomes. So one of the ways would be, when you look at ICF as an organization, can we say that most of the time, 50% of the time or 60% of the time, are we replacing from within, right? So how many positions are we replacing internally as opposed to having to go and get from outside? Because that's another indicator that your succession planning is working, because you've been developing people internally. And I think we've seen quite a bit of that within the existing ICF ecosystem, where we have people who've left the ICF and come back, and others internally have been promoted. So that's quite a good indicator. But then going beyond that, at even higher levels, do we have that documented, right? Do we have that? And how do we measure our success? What other measures are we going to look at? It's not just when you look at even the turnover, for example. How often are these key roles leaving the organization? How much are we retaining them? Those are other measures of success, because remember, we say development, sustainability, and stability are key when it comes to succession itself. And very important as well is to integrate succession planning with a wider talent management approach. If you have a HR manager within the organization, they would understand this. They will be able to support this from a more holistic perspective. But of course, when we're talking about chapters, then it's a whole different kind of scenario. And then looking at the final piece around board engagement. Best practices involve that require that the board itself is involved in this process. They understand that it's important. They're asking the right questions. Do we have succession plans for ICF in place? So if tomorrow we got a resignation from the vice president of marketing, for example, do we have a plan? Or the finance head of the organization, do we have a plan? So those are good questions to ask ourselves. Do we have them documented? If we say yes, do we have it documented? And are we actively planning for their replacement, for their development? When you look at it from a chapter perspective, are your chapter leaders having conversations? As you discuss your strategy, are you discussing succession? Are you discussing the question of who will come after me? So that you're not just thinking about my term ends in 2 years, I'm done, I'm out. But the value that you can add is making sure that these conversations are part of your leadership conversations and preparing for a better ICF tomorrow. Kevin.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. So let's have a look at some practical ideas in terms of your succession pipeline. So as a chapter, How do you create that succession pipeline? Well, the first obvious one is to advertise for elections. So when you advertise for elections, you're calling for nominations. So that's always a great way to try and get people onto your slate. The other one is to try and recruit volunteers during events. So if your chapter is running ICW, if your chapter is running communities of practice, when you call for volunteers, you can also assess their suitability in terms of becoming one of your candidates when you're running your elections, or maybe even to groom them for them to consider becoming volunteer leaders at a later stage. There are so many opportunities to recruit, and this is a great opportunity when you call for volunteers for your events during the year. So the next one is having a look at your ability to have ambassadors. So sometimes when you call for ambassadors at a chapter level, you are asking people to represent the chapter, but not necessarily in an elected position. So some chapters have adopted the ambassador role where you have volunteers to help you either with events or with professional development events so that they can get to know the chapter leaders and also get to have a feel of how a chapter is run. So again, this is something like grooming them to get ready to become a chapter leader. So another great way of trying to get some succession plan in place without the need to be elected into any specific positions. Also important is to ensure that you have acknowledgement of volunteers and give them the rewards. So public appreciation, thanking them. This gives them the feeling that they are valued, as well as giving them a sense of belonging. As coaches, it's great to be a part of ICF because it is a community or family of coaches where we can feel that we belong and we can have conversations to grow and share and help develop one another and the coaching profession. When we acknowledge, we are also inspiring others to join as well. So that's another great reason to recognition of service. Lastly, it's also important to invite the ICF regional team or members of the Professional Coaches Board of Directors to talk to your chapter members so that they can help you inspire potential volunteer candidates to join your chapter as volunteer leaders in the future. It's great for them to know what's happening at a global level and how some of the other chapters can help you in your chapter grow your membership or engage your membership better. So in summary, if we go back to the diagram that Emily walked us through before, in the ICF ecosystem, there are basically 3 sets of leadership. And no matter where we are, we always need to ensure that we have good succession plans in place. So at a global leadership level, your elected board of directors, the chairman, the vice chair, treasurer, strategic initiative directors, and the directors that you have elected, there needs to be succession planning. And we have a nominations committee in order to help us with that as well. At the ICF staff level and your regional teams, you have your regional directors who you work with directly, and then they report into the vice president and the CFO, COO, and CEO as well. And there needs to be succession planning for that so that we don't have long gaps between people departing the organization and recruiting and hiring and getting someone up to speed. So by having, as Emily told us before, a slate of internal and maybe external candidates, that can help us when people move on. And lastly, at the chapter level, at your level, it's always important to make sure that we have the president and president-elect and treasurer, because those are usually statutory positions, that we have all of those candidates filled and nominated and have job descriptions. But we also need to make sure that the other volunteer chapter leader roles, such as membership, communications, public relations or marketing, or maybe even events, professional development, or communities of practice, that all of those job descriptions are created so that it's easy to try and find potential candidates to put onto your pipeline when these volunteer members' terms come to an end. So with that, hopefully we've given you a good overview of succession planning. And on behalf of Emily, we'd like to thank you for your attention and your participation in GLF 2022.